Valet at the resort didn't recognize me when I pulled up in my own car. He looked at my dress, then at the Subaru with the dented bumper, then back at the dress, and I watched him try to do the math. I handed him the keys and told him to be careful with the box in the back seat. He nodded the way people nod when they're not really listening, and I walked up the stone path toward the lanterns thinking, this is going to be one of those nights I'll either laugh about or never speak of again. My name is Imogen Ashbury. I'm 31 years old. I'm a landscape architect, and 3 months before my engagement party, I had finished the final walkthrough of a project I'd been bleeding into for almost 2.5 years. Coastal resort, 6 acres of gardens, a reflecting pool I'd argued for in 17 separate meetings, the kind of work you don't talk about at dinner parties because the people who know don't need to be told and the people who don't know don't really care. My fiancé's mother had decided to host our engagement party at that exact resort. I didn't tell her I'd designed it. I want to be clear about why. It wasn't a gotcha. It wasn't strategy. I just didn't want to give her one more thing to roll her eyes at. She'd already decided, somewhere between the first dinner and the third, that I wasn't enough. She didn't say it. She didn't have to. She arranged me the way you arrange a centerpiece you've been told you can't return. Her name was Cowdonia Pemberton Riggs. She kept the hyphen. She kept everything. She owned a boutique event planning company in San Francisco, the kind that did weddings for tech money and christenings for old money and never advertised because, if you had to ask, you couldn't afford. She'd built it from nothing, and she liked to remind people of that. Except the version of nothing she'd built it from included a small inheritance, a Stanford degree, and a husband whose family had been in shipping since before California was a state. Her nothing had a lot of furniture. My fiancé was her only son. His name was Westcott. Wes. He'd been gone for 9 days when the engagement party happened, somewhere over the Pacific finishing up a deal his board needed him to close in person. He'd called me the night before from Singapore and said, "Emo, just survive it. I'll be there before the toasts." I told him I'd survive it. I told him I'd be fine. I think we both knew I was lying a little. Wes and I had met 3 years earlier on a project. I didn't know who he was. I knew he was the client representative for a resort group that was buying out a struggling property up north. And I knew he'd shown up to a site walk in jeans and an old work shirt and asked smart questions about drainage. I remember thinking he was probably mid-level, maybe a development associate. I asked him out, actually. He laughed about it for weeks afterward. He told me later, much later, that he'd been about to ask me, but I beat him to it by 20 minutes. It took me 4 months to find out his last name was on the building. By then I was already in love with him, which is the only reason I forgave him for it. He said he'd wanted to be sure. He said he'd watched his father date a woman who only liked him for a parking garage in Sacramento, and he promised himself he'd never do that. I told him I would have liked him even with the garage. He said that's exactly why he loved me. We're like that. We talk in circles that come back around. His mother had never quite forgiven him for choosing me, or me for being chosen. I was never sure which. So, the engagement party. Cowdonia had taken it over before I could even pretend to want to plan it. She'd said, "Darling, you have a job, and I've a calling. Let me handle this." She'd said it the way she said most things, which was warm on the surface and cold 3 inches down. I let her. I told myself it didn't matter where the party was or what color the napkins were. I told myself the napkins were not the point. The napkins, it turned out, were never the point. I walked into that resort and the first thing I noticed was the lighting. They'd lit the koi pond from below, which was wrong because I had specifically designed the lanterns along the path to do that job, and lighting it from below made the water look like a swimming pool at a chain hotel. I noticed the second tier planting around the pavilion had been swapped for boxwoods, which I had explicitly written into the maintenance contract as a do not substitute. I noticed someone had moved one of the stone benches into the wrong sightline. I noticed all of this in about 11 seconds, the way you notice a wrong note in a song you wrote. Then I looked up and saw Cowdonia. She was at the top of the pavilion steps in a champagne-colored gown that probably cost more than my car, holding a flute of something pale and effervescent and laughing at whatever the woman next to her had just said. She saw me. The laugh stopped about half a second before her face caught up to it. Then she found the smile again and waved me up with 2 fingers. Imogen darling, you're early. I was, in fact, exactly on time. I checked twice. Hi, Cadonia. She air-kissed me on both cheeks and held me at arm's length and looked at my dress. It was navy, long sleeves, nothing fancy. I'd picked it because I knew I'd be on my feet for hours and I didn't want to be tugging at anything. Oh, she said. That's lovely. Very practical. I knew what she meant. So did the woman standing next to her, who had the courtesy to look at her shoes. I thought we said cocktail, Cadonia added gently, as if reminding a child. You said cocktail. This is cocktail. It's certainly cocktail adjacent. I felt the first warm trickle of what was coming, and I made myself breathe through my nose. Wes had told me to survive the night. I had committed to surviving the night. Where would you like me? I asked. Oh, sweetheart, I've put you at table 6, right near the kitchen in case you need anything at all. Table 6. I had sat in on enough of these to know that table 6 was not the family table. The family table was table 1. The family table was always table 1. Cadonia had put my future husband's fiancée at the catering staff overflow. I smiled. I said, perfect. I went to table 6. The first hour was, in retrospect, the easy hour. I drank a club soda. I made small talk with a woman from Cadonia's spin class and a man who I think was someone's accountant. I watched the room fill up with 200 people I'd never met, all of whom seemed to know exactly which fork to use for what. The thing I kept thinking, sitting at table 6, was that this was my engagement party. Mine. Wes's. Ours. And I knew exactly one person in this entire room, and she was running it like a regional summit, and that person had spent the last 6 months looking at me the way you look at a stain you can't quite identify. At hour 2, Cadonia took the microphone. She did the thank yous. She did the joke about Wes being late to his own engagement, which got a polite ripple of laughter from people who, statistically, were probably very tired of jokes about Wes being late to things. She introduced her husband, who lifted a glass without standing up. She did not introduce me. Then she said, and I quote, "Because I have replayed this in my head enough times that I could draw it on a napkin from memory. And as many of you know, I do believe in being honest, even when it's hard. So I want to address something that I think a lot of you have been gracious enough not to ask me about, because Westcott's choices, of course, are his own. But I'd been a planner for 30 years. And one of the things you learn in this business is that there's a difference between someone who builds something and someone who, well, decorates it." The room got very quiet very fast. She was looking at me. Not directly. She was looking at the chandelier in that practiced way that older women do when they're pretending not to look at someone. "My future daughter-in-law," she said, and the words came out with the carefulness of someone walking through wet paint, "is a sweet, sweet girl. She works very hard at her little design firm, and I just want to say, in front of everyone, that I think it takes a special kind of confidence to step into a family like ours and just—" She paused. "Show up." A few people laughed, uncertainly. A few didn't. "Anyway," she said, "some of you may have heard there was a small issue earlier this year with a portfolio matter. I'm not going to get into it. But I do think honesty is the foundation of family, and I think everyone deserves to know who they're welcoming in. So," she turned. She gestured at the AV person. A slide came up on the screen behind her. It was a side-by-side. On the left, an aerial photograph of a garden I recognized immediately, because I had laid out every plan on it. On the right, the cover of a coffee table book by a landscape architect named Theron Marsh, who was a colleague of mine. Sort of, in the way that all of us are colleagues of each other. "This is a project my future daughter-in-law has been telling our family she designed," Cadonia said. "And this," she tapped the right side of the screen, "is the published work of Theron Marsh, one of the most respected names in the field. I'm not making any accusations, I'm just putting it out there. In the spirit of openness, I sat at table 6 and I felt every single person in that room turn to look at me. I want to tell you that I was calm. I want to tell you that I was already 3 steps ahead and that I was sitting there smiling and waiting for the moment to strike. I wasn't. I was sitting there with my hand around a glass of club soda and I was thinking very clearly in the way you think, when you've been shoved hard, that I had two choices. I could stand up and yell, or I could not. I want to tell you I made a wise decision. What actually happened was that I couldn't stand up because my legs were shaking too hard, so I stayed sitting, and I pulled out my phone. I sent 2 texts. The first was to my partner at the firm, Odessa Wexley Churong. Odessa is, in addition to being one of the best plant people I have ever met, the kind of friend who picks up at any hour and asks no questions until you're ready. I sent her, I need you to email me the full project archive for the Beach Glass Resort. Originals. Now. Tonight. Open. The second text was to a woman I'd worked with on the Beach Glass project for almost 2 years. Her name was Ndidi Okonkwo-Brennan, and she was the senior development officer at the resort group. She was the one who'd hired me. She was the one who'd fought for my fee against the original budget. She was the one who'd hugged me at the ribbon cutting and told me her grandmother would have liked the rose garden. I texted her, "Where are you tonight?" She wrote back in 8 seconds. "At your party. Caldonia invited me. I'm in the back. Are you okay?" I looked up. Across the room, behind a column near the bar, I saw her. White wrap dress, reading glasses on her head like a crown. She was looking right at me. I shook my head just slightly. She raised her eyebrows. I picked up my phone again. I typed, "Were you here for the speech?" She typed, "Every word. Imogen, what is happening?" I typed, "Can I borrow you for 10 minutes?" She typed, "I was already on my way. I want to slow down here because the next part is the part that mattered." Caldonia was still talking. She'd moved on from the slide to a story about a fundraiser she'd organized for the symphony, and people were laughing, but it was a different kind of laughing. The kind that happens when a room has been handed something it doesn't know what to do with. Half the people in that room were now wondering if I was a fraud. The other half were wondering if Caldonia was a monster. Both halves wanted more information. I'm not going to pretend I was thinking clearly. I was thinking about Wes. I was thinking about how he'd told me to survive. I was thinking about how every time something hard happened in my childhood, I'd been the one to put my head down and absorb it. Because that's what you did. That was the strategy. You took the hit, and you didn't make a scene. And 25 years of that had built me into a person who could be publicly humiliated at her own engagement party and not knock over a single glass. And I was thinking that if I let this happen, if I sat there at table 6 and ate the canapes and pretended to laugh, I would be choosing that version of myself for the rest of my marriage. I would be saying yes to every dinner, every Christmas, every grandchild's birthday party, where Caldonia got to define what was true, and I got to nod. I stood up. It was less dramatic than it sounds. I just stood. I picked up my club soda. I walked toward the front of the room. A small thing happened that I want to mention because I think about it a lot. As I walked past table 4, an older man I didn't know reached out and squeezed my elbow. He didn't say anything. He just squeezed it. I have no idea who he was. I would like to find him someday and thank him. I got to the microphone. Caldonia was holding it. She looked at me with the surprise of someone who has not been interrupted in approximately 20 years. "Imogen," she said. "Sweetheart, this isn't the time. I just want to say a few words," I said. "Since it's my engagement party." There was a pause. Then she handed me the microphone. She had to. There were 200 people watching, and any version of her not handing me the microphone would have looked worse than what was about to happen to her. I held the microphone. I looked out at the room. I had never spoken to 200 people at once. I had given presentations to clients, sure. I had walked city councils through master plans. But this was different. This was the kind of room where everyone had already decided who you were before you opened your mouth. So I didn't try to change their minds, I just told them what was true. "Hi," I said. "I'm Imogen. I'm the one who's supposed to be marrying Westcott. Some of you know me. Most of you don't. I'd like to thank Caldonia for putting this together. It's a beautiful party." I waited a beat. I'd also like to say that I'm a landscape architect. I've been one for 9 years. I have a master's degree from Berkeley and a license in 3 states, and I designed this resort. I heard, very distinctly, someone in the back of the room say, "Oh, the garden you walked through to get here, the pavilion you're sitting in, the reflecting pool. The pathway lighting, which is currently lit incorrectly, but we'll fix that another time." A few people laughed. I think it surprised me as much as it surprised them. All of it. I did all of it. It took 2.5 years. There's a plaque by the entrance with my firm's name on it. I noticed nobody walked past it on the way in, which is fine, that's how plaques work. Cardonia opened her mouth. I kept going. The image my future mother-in-law just showed you, comparing my work to Theron Marsh's book? Theron Marsh wrote the foreword for that book, but the project on that cover is mine. I have the original CAD files. I have the contracts. I have the publication credit. I have, in fact, the actual designer of record on speed dial, because she's standing in the back of this room. I lifted my hand and pointed. Nidhi stepped out from behind the column. She walked, calmly, across the room. She was holding her phone. She got to the microphone. I handed it to her. She said, "Hi, my name is Nidhi Okonkwo-Brennan. I am the Senior Vice President of Development for the Beach Glass Resort Group, which owns this property. We hired Imogen Ashbury and her firm to design these grounds in 2022. She was the principal designer of record. I personally signed the contract. I personally watched her redraw the koi pond plan 4 times because she was not satisfied. The reason this resort looks the way it does is because of her." She paused. She looked at Cardonia. She did it without any particular anger, which is what made it terrible. I was invited tonight because I'm a personal friend of the family of the groom. I was happy to come. I am less happy now. She handed the microphone back to me. I want to tell you that this is where Cardonia apologized. She didn't. She did something worse, which was that she tried to laugh. "Well," she said, "it seems I've made a mistake with the slide." "It seems you have," I said. "I was given that information by a very reliable source and Cardonia." I said it quietly. The microphone was still in my hand. The room could hear it. "You weren't given anything. You made it up." She froze. "I knew it the way you know things about people who have spent 6 months trying to make you smaller. I knew it because I knew her. I knew the way she rearranged stories, the way she would mention something in passing that wasn't quite true, and then act surprised when it got repeated back to her wrong, the way she'd planted 3 different rumors about me with 3 different cousins to see which one would stick. She had not been given a slide. She had made a slide, and she had made it because she thought no one in the room would know enough to challenge it, and the one person who did know was sitting at table 6, trying not to ruin her hair. I didn't say any of that. I didn't have to. The room had already done the math. A small, very quiet voice from somewhere near the bar said, "Oh my God." Cardonia's husband stood up. He was a tall, gray man I'd met maybe 4 times. He'd always been polite to me in a way that suggested he was sorry, but didn't quite know what for. He walked, slowly, to the front of the room. He took the microphone from his wife. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, he looked at me. "Imogen," he said, "I owe you an apology, on behalf of my family. I'm very sorry." He didn't look at Cardonia again. He set the microphone down on the lectern. He walked off the stage. There was a silence I have never heard before or since. 200 people in a pavilion, and the only sound was a koi splashing in the wrongly lit pond. And then the doors at the back of the room opened. I want to tell you, Wes came running in like a movie. He didn't. He came in like a man who had been on a plane for 15 hours and a car for 2 and didn't quite know what room he was walking into. He had his garment bag over one shoulder. He hadn't changed. He was in the same shirt I'd watched him pack. He saw me at the front of the room with a microphone in my hand. He saw his mother frozen at the lectern. He saw his father walking off the stage. He looked at the slide still up on the screen. He set down the garment bag. He walked the long way across the entire pavilion, past every single table. He didn't look at his mother. He didn't look at his father. He didn't look at any of the 200 people watching him. He walked all the way up to the front. He stopped in front of me. He put his hand on the side of my face. He said, "Hi, love. Sorry I'm late. And then he kissed me, in front of everyone the way he always kissed me. Which is to say, like nobody else was in the room. When he pulled back, he looked at the screen. He looked at the side-by-side image. He looked at his mother. He didn't say anything to her. He just turned to the room and said, very simply, "For anyone who didn't know, my fiancée designed this place. The whole thing. I asked her to marry me on the bench by the south end of the reflecting pool, which she also designed." He paused. "I'd like to propose a toast." Somebody handed him a glass. "To Imogen," he said, "who is, by every measure I know how to take, the most honest person in this room." A few people raised their glasses. Then a few more. Then almost everyone. Not Caudonia. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant. I want to tell you there was a soaring moment. There wasn't. What I felt mostly was tired. The kind of tired that gets into your bones when you've been bracing for something for a long time and finally don't have to anymore. I learned the rest in pieces over the next few weeks. Caudonia had not, in fact, been given this slide by anyone. She'd made it. She'd had her assistant, a very nice young woman named Pollyanna, who later quit and sent me a long apologetic email, mock up a comparison using stock images and a screenshot of Theron Marsh's book cover. The source was her own assumption that nobody in the room would care enough to verify. She lost the Beach Glass account 2 weeks later. And Dee Dee made sure of it. She didn't do it out of spite. She did it because, as she said to me on the phone the next morning, "Imogen, I cannot in good conscience continue to refer high-end clients to a planner who fabricated a portfolio attack at a private event. It's a liability issue. That's all it is." Caudonia called me 11 days after the party. She left a voicemail. She said, "Imogen, I'd like to talk when you're ready." I haven't called her back yet. Wes and I got married 6 months later. We did it at City Hall with 11 people. His father came. His mother didn't. We had dinner afterward at a noodle place I'd been going to since I was 23, and Dee Dee was there. Odessa was there. The older man who'd squeezed my elbow at the engagement party turned out to be Wes's uncle on his father's side, and he came too, and he gave a toast that made Wes cry. The thing I want to say, if you've made it this far, is that I didn't win anything that night. I know it sounds like I did. I know it has the shape of a victory. But the truth is, what I got back wasn't a prize. It was just my own name, my own work, my own face in my own mirror. For most of my life, I had been the person who got smaller when other people got louder. I had been the kid who didn't raise her hand. The teenager who let other people take credit for the group project, the young woman in early jobs who let men in meetings repeat her ideas back to the room and accept the nod. I had built a whole quiet self out of being agreeable because somewhere along the way I had been taught that agreeable was the same thing as good. It isn't. There is a difference between being kind and being available for erasure. I didn't know that for a long time. I learned it standing in front of 200 people with a microphone in my hand and my legs shaking and the wrong lights in my koi pond. I want to tell anyone who has ever sat at the wrong table at their own party that you don't have to flip it over. You don't have to scream. You don't have to make yourself the loudest person in the room. You just have to tell the truth out loud in your own voice, even when your voice is shaking. Especially when it's shaking. I am still soft. I am still quiet. I still wear the practical navy dress to events where everyone else is in sequins. None of that changed. But I sit at table 1 now. And I built the table. I think about that night more than I'd like to admit. Not because I miss it, because I keep finding new layers to it, the way you keep finding new rooms in a house you thought you knew. The thing nobody tells you about being publicly humiliated is that it isn't really about the humiliator. It's about every single time before that you let yourself be made smaller. Caudonia didn't invent the seat at table 6. She just sat me in one I'd been sitting in my whole life. The wrong table at the school cafeteria. The meeting where my idea got passed around the room without my name on it. The boyfriend in my 20s who introduced me as my friend for almost a year. I had practiced being overlooked until I was so good at it that I could do it in a navy dress at my own engagement party and barely flinch. The cause was old. The effect just happened to be public. What I learned, standing up there with the microphone shaking in my hand, is that quiet is not the same as weak. I had always thought you had to be loud to be strong. I'd watched loud women my whole life and assumed they had something I didn't. But the truth is, Caudonia was the loud one that night. She had the microphone first. She had the slide. She had the prepared speech. And she still lost because loud without truth is just noise, and noise eventually runs out of breath. I don't believe in karma the way some people mean it. I don't think the universe was keeping score. But I do believe that the way you treat people creates a kind of weather around you, and eventually you have to live in it. Caudonia built a storm. She didn't get to stand outside of it just because she was the one who built it. That's not punishment. That's just physics. The hardest part of all of this wasn't the night itself. It was forgiving myself afterward for all the years I'd spent learning to disappear. There's a version of me that's still angry at the 23-year-old who let a coworker present her drawings. There's a version that's still angry at the 15-year-old who didn't tell the teacher she actually was in that class. I'm trying to be gentler with those versions of me. They were doing the best they could with what they'd been taught. If you take anything from this, take this. Be kind, stay soft, wear the practical dress if you want to, but the next time someone hands you the wrong seat, walk up to the front of the room anyway. You don't have to be loud. You don't have to be cruel. You just have to be the one person who's willing to say out loud what's true. That's all strength has ever been. That's all it ever needed to be.